Hi there, and welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast about the reality of teaching English. I'm your host, Kelly Pennington. Thank you for joining me today.
Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited today. Thank you, Evan, for joining me, accepting the invitation. And for those of you who don't know Evan Frendo, well, if you work in business English, you probably do. But if you don't, here's a little bit of his bio. He's been working in business English and ESP since 1993. And mostly you deal with corporate training in company, working directly with corporate clients, large, small, mostly in company. You do corporate training. You have corporate training experience, including full-time in-house as well as part-time, but mostly intensive hotel-based training you did as well.
That's right, yes. Many years ago, I had to make the decision. Do I do extensive training, so once a week, twice a week, or do I do blocks of 4 or 5 days in a hotel? And if you do one, you can't really do the other because you keep having to cancel. So I made the decision last century and went with intensive training. So all I do is really 1, 2, 3, 4 days seminars now. I don't do
Okay, interesting. That's interesting. Okay. Other than that, Evan is a conference speaker. He regularly is invited to speak at ELT or business English related conferences around the world. He has some are recorded and available on YouTube. You work with the IATEFL BSIG plenary last year in November, and most of these things you can find on your website, right? Because you do post a lot of them. Yeah.
Yes.
So the website for those who are interested is what is it?
www.e4b.de.
Thank you.
E4b.de.
Yeah, I can I just type E4 in my browser and it just automatically fills it. So I always forget because I go there. Okay. Also, you're involved in materials writing, both in-house, tailor-made for corporate clients as well as for international publishers. Oh my God, 30 plus published books so far?
Yeah, that's just a factor of age. If you do one book every couple of years, it slowly builds up, Kelly.
Evan, that's impressive, though. Good job.
For various publishers around the world. Yeah.
See, he knows what he's talking about. Also involved in consulting and advising language schools, corporate training departments, as well as individual trainers. He is involved in teacher training, both in-house corporate training, in-house language school training, international certificates, and these courses usually you give face-to-face or online. I had the pleasure of working with you online. It was very informational. I enjoyed it very much. And you're I'm the greatest kind of student because I'm type A personality and I like to prepare lots of stuff.
Yeah.
You also are working with methodology books for Pearson, how to teach business English, which was in 2005. You're still selling it around the world. I used it for my Delta last year, so it is still a reference.
I'm reading it still. Yeah, there aren't many other books. The publishers don't really want to publish methodology books because they tend not to sell. So that's still one of the mainstream books for how to be a business English teacher. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's amazing. 20 years later and it's still selling well. Yeah.
Well, it's still applicable. Some things have minorly changed, but the theory behind it is all applicable.
Yeah, most of it's pretty much the same. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Good. And then finally, you also are involved with teaching associations and you've held volunteer posts in both TESOL and IATEFL. All of his, there it is, you have it here. The articles, videos, recordings, presentation slides, please feel free. I'll put it in the show notes, but it's www.e4b.de to see all of his wonderful information. I used a lot of them, so feel free to access everyone. Welcome. Officially. So I've got a couple questions for you because your current interests are research into BELF.
Yes.
Corpus linguistics, maritime English, but can we start with BELF?
Yes, of course. BELF is English as a business lingua franca. So it's this idea, the research into this area is really looking at how people use English as a lingua franca in many business contexts all over the world. And that research is showing that it's actually the language that is used and spoken in business contexts is actually a little bit different to what we've traditionally been teaching in ELT. because there's no adherence to native speaker norms, for example. There's no standard form that's correct. It's always context specific. It's very variable, very flexible. Language emerges from the situation, as it were. And so what is right in one context may not be appropriate in another context. And people have been starting to really investigate this sort of language over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it's fascinating. And it really is what we're all about as business English teachers. So yeah, it's right at the center of what I do at the moment, trying to understand BELF. Yeah.
And how are you involved in that? What are you working on? I know that you're working with Helen and some other teachers.
Right. Yes, a few teachers. A group of us started up a small Facebook group or a website called Conversations About BELF. You can put it in the maybe in the notes afterwards, Kelly.
I will.
And that's open to any teacher who's interested in talking about using English in a business as a business lingua franca. So next, we're having another meeting, for example, on the 13th of this month, and the topic is BELF-oriented materials. How do we make our materials more useful to people trying to operate in a lingua franca environment as opposed to a standard English environment? So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be lots of interesting discussions, I'm sure. But you know, I've been working with BELF because BELF is part and parcel of what I do as a business English teacher. That's really where it's at. The last few years, I've been working in maritime English, for example, looking at conversations between ships and shore-based stations, and every single conversation is between people from completely different cultures. They're both normally non-native speakers, and they're using English as a lingua franca in order to get their work done. And so, you know, trying to help people operate in that sort of environment means that you have to try and understand what it is to use English in a lingua franca context. And so it's fundamental to what we do if we're working in business English. Yeah.
So this idea, actually, recently at the most recent conference that we had here in Brazil, some people were familiar or have heard of ELF. BELF, almost not, like a very small percentage. And so then how would you kind of advise people, or where can people start? Because if we think about, okay, so the traditional materials and things that we've seen maybe are not going to be conducive to preparing our students in the best way. So then where do these people start?
Well, the thing about English as a lingua franca is you can't really teach it. It's not a product. It's not a language that you can say this is right and this is wrong. The whole point about this sort of research is finding out that language is extremely variable, very context specific. And so what we're trying to do is maybe change people's attitudes so that they're aware of this, and they're helping students not decide what is right and wrong, but what is most effective in a particular situation. So, for example, one thing will BELF teachers or BELF-oriented teachers or people thinking in a BELF manner, attitude, would think about accommodation skills. Accommodation is where you change the way you speak in order to adapt to a particular person. Much like a mother talking to a young child speaks in a very different way to the mother talking to maybe her boss at work. We change our language according to how we speak and who we're speaking to. And so that's a typical strategy which effective users of lingua franca in a business context do all the time. They adapt their language. For example, another example would be, German engineers, say, working in a factory in China and having to speak to people working the machines, and their English might really not be very good. If the German comes in with high-level English and big words and convoluted phrases and things, that's just not going to work in terms of communication. And so it's adapting and helping people adapt and learning the communication strategies in order to operate in these sorts of very specific contexts. That's what BELF is about, really.
So then, interesting, but then how does that change, or how have you seen working in the maritime industry, because you have a lot of experience in that, how have you seen that change your, for example, onboarding process, needs analysis process? Because I feel like that's probably going to be most impacted with this change in mindset that we're not doing right and wrong, not a product. Now we're kind of assessing situations.
Well, this is the whole irony, because my background is actually in ESP. I have a master's in English for specific purposes, and that is all about doing a needs analysis, understanding the target language, so what the students need to be able to do in future, trying to work out where they are now, and then trying to close that gap. But to do that, you have to understand the target language. Now, what people in BELF are saying is, well, that target language is moving all the time. It's a moving target. Perhaps we can't pin it down as confidently as we used to think we could within an ESP mindset, let's say. So perhaps now our life is becoming more challenging as teachers, because in the past, when I started, things were right and wrong, and I could analyze the language of a particular context and quite happily teach it. Now it's not that simple. There are more things to think about, I think. So you mentioned needs analysis, and that's one area where it's changing. But of course, BELF
so then
also,
where do people go? I mean, it's kind of like, oh, so then how do we even approach this? Do we have anything proceduralized, or there's nothing really? We're just kind of...
I think needs analysis is absolutely fundamental. Trying to understand the context our students, our learners are going to be working in is still absolutely at the core of what we do. But understanding that language is not as clear cut as perhaps we thought it was.
Not as rigid. We don't have these boxes anymore.
English, because English is not a thing. English is a moving entity. It's a complex system. It changes. Languages, if you're thinking about BELF, you're thinking about things like something called translanguaging, which is the idea that languages don't really have borders between each other. Now, in the past, we would say, yes, Spanish is clear, Portuguese is clear, and English is clear. With a BELF perspective, what we're saying is these tend to merge into each other much more, and that's acceptable, and that's actually what works. And of course, if you go into any Brazilian workplace, it won't be perfect, whatever perfect English is, but there'll be mixtures all the time, and people will be adapting to local context. And somebody coming in from outside, if I was to come into a Brazilian meeting, which you're attending, I probably wouldn't understand some of the stuff just because it's very local context. So it's understanding this and dealing with helping people get communication strategies so that they can do this successfully. Asking questions to clarify much more than in a normal conversation in your own context. Absolutely key. Even the simplest words like, I don't know, contract might be different in different contexts. And so both sides in a conversation might be using the same word and both think they understand what the other one is talking about, but they both have a very different concept of this word. And so a BELF approach to teaching would say, okay, take words like contract and just make sure you clarify what both sides mean by contract before moving on with your negotiation. What do we mean by contract? Yeah.
It's interesting because then, and I've seen this, thank God that it's finally starting to happen, where people are starting to focus more on strategies, skill building, critical thinking, the thing in business that we call soft skills, things like that, because I think they were left behind a little bit when we were focused so much as on language has to be this way, and this is the most, this is the most appropriate thing to say. It's like, well, it's the most appropriate, but is it efficient? Especially in business context, like we don't have the luxury of time sometimes, so we just have to make sure that it gets across.
Gets the job done.
Right.
Far more important than sort of meeting some theoretical English standard because it's in the test. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have in our business. We're guided by things like international tests, big tests, which are very, not rigid, I wouldn't say rigid, but it's hard for a test to adapt to local context. So it does have to say, yes, this is right and this is wrong. So what we're testing is actually not English as a lingua franca for a specific context. And so we're often teaching to the test. People want to pass these tests because they get jobs with these tests. But if the tests aren't teaching the sort of language they need, then there's a problem in the system. And it's the same with plenty of course books as well. Publishers, of course, put things into a book, and that becomes the model language. And it's very difficult for a teacher with a say a gap fill exercise to say, well, both are right, or it doesn't really matter. You have to sometimes come down and say, well, that's right and that's wrong. but actually it's very often they're both right, more or less, and it depends on the context. So sometimes they are right and wrong, and sometimes it depends. And yeah, it's challenging. It's a very challenging time in English language teaching.
It gets fuzzy. It gets very fuzzy, and a lot of times teachers are not very comfortable with saying, well, it's easier to say if this is right, this is wrong, right? That's the easy. It's easy and it's comfortable.
That's what
Yeah.
teachers do.
I have some people that will send me messages and say, Kelly, what do I say in this scenario? I'm like, well, tell me what's going on, because what are you trying to convey to the person? What are you trying to convey as the message? And sometimes, this might be too aggressive. This might be not as, so we don't know.
Well, and that is actually one of the biggest challenges, because, of course, what we're talking about is a community of practice, how people use language in a certain group, in a certain community. But as teachers, we're not members of that community. We don't know the language there either. We're outsiders. And so if we're outsiders and our learners are outsiders, it's very, very challenging to practice the right sort of language which they will need in the target community. And there is some research going on which shows that people learn English in a BELF context far better by using English in the workplace, perhaps getting some coaching, but sticking to the local context and not taking those people out and putting them in a traditional language classroom. So this is actually
interesting.
quite challenging for our whole profession if we take it to a logical conclusion. Maybe people learn best by doing. And I can say from my own experience working in company, the best communicators, the best English users in my experience were always people who went to lots of meetings, interacted with the foreign customers. It wasn't people who came to my classes and then went away and spoke German to everybody else. I happen to live in Germany. We like to think of ourselves as pretty key, but actually a lot more learning can happen outside in a business context. And it might be that we evolve into that, into on-the-job type training and coaching people on the job more than traditional classrooms. Put 12 people in a room and hope they all learn at the same pace and at the same time and learn the same thing.
I mean, it just stepping back a bit, it's just kind of hilarious to think that is the model right now. We just, we take all of these very unique individuals, stick them together and be like, let's hope and pray that this is what's the outcome, right?
Try and find a compromise. I mean, think of the school system where what group you're in depends on how old you are, for goodness sake. You're 12 years old, then you should be in third grade. 14 years old, you should be in fifth grade, or whatever system it is. But it's done on age and where you happen to live, and nothing on your ability to learn a language, on your learning skills, on your own preference. I mean, all the key things we know about learning are totally ignored in most school systems in the world, sadly.
Yeah, I think we're on the precipice of seeing something that's going to be like, okay, we've reached the point now we're going to have to revisit this at some point, because it's just, okay, that's a whole nother.
AI is coming in, and technology is coming in. Maybe AI isn't quite there yet, but we're already seeing people using translation software all the time in companies. People go into a meeting and they're sitting there with their smartphones translating things all the time. This is happening, and it's not going to take much more before we can actually speak into one machine that comes out perfectly well in a perfectly good communication in another machine. And if there are some mishaps and things, well, that doesn't matter, because the people there can normally work out where the problem areas are. And if I'm a businessman, would I spend 3, 4, 5 years learning English to intermediate level, or would I go in with an app?
I'm hoping they don't go in with apps, because then I'm out of a job at some point. But
I think our jobs are changing, but certainly these sorts of tools are in companies. When was the last time you wrote an email in a foreign language and didn't use a translation software to check it?
Yeah.
We all do.
Guilty.
Every person I know. I live in Germany. I'm reasonable at German, but if I write an email, it's become easier to write it in English and press one button and then have a read of the German version and say, yes, that's roughly what I wanted to say. Press send. It's so much faster, so much quicker, and this is happening. Whatever we as teachers like to think, this is here. This is not the future. This is now.
Yeah. So then that being said, there was another topic that we had emailed back and forth about that I was actually really interested for you to at least, I'm going to try and get some bits of knowledge, pick your
Yeah.
brain a little bit of DDL.
Okay, yeah, DDL, data-driven learning. Now, this is the
Mm.
exact opposite of what we've just been talking about.
Okay, so let's be contrary today.
Data-driven learning basically means that you have a corpus, so a collection of texts, spoken or written, but they're on a computer somewhere. And the teacher or the student or both can access this collection in order to analyze language and look at it. And it's a very, very useful way of learning. I'll give you a very simple example. You can go into, even if you don't have your own collection of electronic texts, these things are available online. Skell is a very, very common one, SKELL. And you type in a word, information, press a button, and you'll get lots and lots of examples from real text using the word information. So as many as you want. You'll get an analysis of words that go with information. So collocates, collocations. So, what words go in front of information, what words go behind information, what doesn't go with these words. And so this has become quite a useful tool for us to use in language learning. I know as a language learner myself, if you go away with one example sentence of a new phrase or a new word, or if you go with 10, the 10 is always going to be better. You come away with a much better feeling of how that word is used or how that phrase is used. And that's all data-driven learning is. It's this idea that we use these collection of electronically available texts, spoken or written, to analyze language. And I can give you plenty of examples I've done with my own students.
I would like to hear the examples, but I want to know if you've ever heard, because it's kind of popular here in Brazil, Youglish. Have you ever heard of this site?
No,
but
there are lots of them. Okay, what's Youglish?
And so you type in a word or a short phrase. It can't be too long, can't be too specific, and it searches YouTube.
Yeah,
for all of the things, and then it comes up with all of the videos. And so I know a lot of teachers who have been using this for people to see. For example, if I'm teaching some sort of lexical point or something like that, I'll say, okay, so let's take a look. I'll use it with my students too, put it in there. And then sometimes you'll have, depending on how specific the word or phrase is, sometimes you'll have like thousands of examples of people using this. And the great thing about it is that it's very non-discriminant. So you'll get things from everywhere. So I love it because it's like combating the native speakerism idea too, because you get people all over, and it's quite nice. So, but it's all based on YouTube.
That's a perfect example of data-driven learning. It's looking at the messy world of real language. And so sometimes you come up with more questions than answers because it leads to things. But what it does mean is, at least for some students, they start looking at this stuff and they start exploring and they start noticing. And noticing is an important word in language learning. This idea that you look at a lexical item or a grammatical form or something and you think about it. You don't just let it go past you. And so people start thinking about this form and people start focusing on language. And that's a good way of learning, at least for some learners. So it's I think that what you've just described is exactly what I'm talking about. YouTube is just one collection. It's a corpus of texts, spoken or written. That's exactly what it is.
And then you said you had some examples of the ways that you use this type of.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can do it on computers. You don't have to do it on with a computer analysis software. I mean, something like the one you've just talked about is actually quite complex algorithms and software going on behind the scenes. But if you take, for example, earning calls, I don't know if you know what an earning call is. Companies have regular meetings with their shareholders where the important people in the company talk about maybe the last 3 months and talk about the next 3 months, what's coming, where the problems are, and so on. And then it's opened up to questions and answers, and shareholders will come in. Now, because of the internet, a lot of these things, there are hundreds of thousands of these now on the internet, very often with transcripts. You press a button and the transcript is there, a written transcript of real live up-to-date conversations about what's going on in certain companies. Now, this is a very particular
I mean, we are business English teachers, so this is where we'd like to go.
Exactly. There aren't that many around, and I found, for example, that I could. Now you can't download these onto your own computer without permission. That's quite clear in the texts, and you can't therefore analyze them using traditional corpus analysis software or corpus linguistics or whatever. But what you can do is do it in paper form. So you can say to your students, okay, everybody go away for half an hour and come back with 4 if sentences from earning calls. And so if you have a group of, say, 6 people, they come back with 24, you all write it on the board. And then you start looking at these if sentences and find out that they don't actually look anything like maybe the if sentences you've looked at in textbooks. And that people start looking at patterns. Data-driven learning is all about looking at patterns and trying to get a feel for the language. And so you start recognizing different ways that if sentences are used. Now, it might be too difficult in terms of grammar for the teacher to explain, but
I was going to say this idea, it's for someone, I feel like, in the classroom who's very confident in their abilities to deal with possible ambiguities and things like that, because
yes, confident or honest enough to say, look, I can't explain this. You can't explain it in your language. I can't explain it in my language or the one I'm good at here. But let's look at these patterns. Let's see if we can understand some phrases. Everybody leave the classroom with 2 or 3 useful phrases which they like and put it into their vocabulary notebook.
Yeah.
Or so that's a simple one with if sentences. But that particular lesson came out then with people saying, well, actually, I noticed this phrase which I like. And one of the phrases which came out was, could I have a little color on that? Now, I had never come across this phrase, and actually when we started exploring all our different earnings calls, we found it was quite common. And what it means is, could I have a little bit more information?
Oh, interesting. Never heard it used like that. Okay.
Exactly. It's a common idiom which is used, I think, mostly in American business contexts. But language is changing.
Those Americans,
Yeah, it was always spelled COLOR, so.
Well, we take the U out of everything. It's not necessary.
Well, I assume they were in American context. But the point is, that we then started discussing, oh, can I have a little bit of color? And it became one of the phrases we used in the course, in our own little community of practice, to use a term we used 10 minutes ago. And so that's how language develops, that people identify something, they start noticing it, talking about it, and before long they're using it, and it becomes part and parcel of everybody's active vocabulary, active phraseology, whatever you want to call it, active lexis.
I think it's interesting. I think the more, it seems to me that that's quite engaging for learners, especially when they kind of understand this concept that it's not black and white all the time. Everything is very dependent upon context, and so with them having understanding of that, their expectations also kind of are balanced out a little bit. I think sometimes they have these other types of expectations of what the language course is going to give them, and it makes it easier for us to do our job, right?
And in a sense, this links into the whole English as a lingua franca discussion we were having earlier about, it's a lot more complicated than we sometimes try and tell our students by selling it as a product. This is intermediate level English. I mean, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure either. Sometimes I'm like, ooh, let's put our fingers on that. I'm not.
I know. I mean, there are websites produced by very well-known publishers and very well-known researchers who actually analyze vocabulary and say, yes, this is a typical word at level 3, and this is a typical word at level 5. But the reality is it depends on context. Gas turbine might be a very complex word and would be a level 3 word. But if you work in a gas turbine factory, it would be a beginner's word because that's the product. So it's so context specific, all this. I've just called up, I had my list of examples with color. So here we go. Any color there would be helpful. To add a little more color, I have no real color to add. I guess I'd just add a little bit of color. You've given some good color on this. Could you provide some color on? Could you talk about what sort of color? Appreciate the color. Thanks for the color. And these were things which I had
Wow.
never, ever come across as a business English teacher. And
No, I've
maybe,
never heard of that either.
and and it comes from your.
I know. Well, I
think you're
feel quite
American.
ignorant. Well, I'm in Brazil. Like, let's just put that in context. I live in Brazil now.
No, but that's the point. Language changes, and these were
Right.
clearly, this was not a one-off. This took 10, 15 minutes for the classroom to just go through these earnings calls and print it out and look at, and all of them underlined, one or two of them. So that's the reality of data-driven learning. You come up with really interesting stuff, which a teacher could never do, because a teacher wouldn't know, you know.
That's actually really wonderful. I think that we have to try and come up with new things and think about it, that whatever best serves our clients, right? So
yeah,
maybe we're
no,
doing an in-service on something.
Certain types of groups. I mean, some groups may say, look, this is not your job, teacher. I want to go through a traditional type of course. This is how I've learned languages all my life. So there is some, getting together with your learners, working on learner autonomy, saying, look, it's you who's responsible for your learning, not me. But we can work. I'm here to help you. Once you start changing people's mindset and start explaining how language actually works, and it's not really just a black and white thing and product, but more of a process which is changing all the time. I think people appreciate that because it fits in with their understanding of what's really happening. But it does take a bit of effort with some classes to do that. And other classes, you probably get some resistance, and some classes will say, oh, yes, great, no more grammar ever again, teacher. We love you.
I mean, you could sell it on Instagram because everybody wants to no more grammar classes. Just a quick question, because I know we're coming to the end here, but have you felt any resistance from companies when you've tried to implement some of these ideas like BELF and DDL and stuff? I don't know if you're working with maritime companies. Are they resistant to it, or are they open? Have you tried? I don't know.
If you explain to people and you show, you have to be able to put your arguments and win your arguments. But things like data-driven learning, for example, they say, well, yeah, teach them the language of contracts. And I say, okay, but I need dozens of example contracts. And they say, oh, no, confidential. And I say, well, I can't teach them the language of contracts then. So
where do you want me to get that?
They turn up in the next email, and you've got your database, and then you can start analyzing those texts, and that's very easy to do with very freely available software. And you can find out the most frequent terms, the common collocations, all the things which we were talking about with data-driven learning. So I think both BELF and data-driven learning work very, very well in companies. It's just a matter of persuading people that they're not going to get what was probably done in their schools 20 or 30 years ago, or what they think language learning should be like. I've even been in companies where, and I've probably told you this story before, where people say, look, you are the teacher, you can't produce simulations and role plays, you have no idea what our people do in the meetings, we will write those for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I just send in an invoice at the end of it. But the point is, these are communities of practice, and once people understand that your job as a trainer is to help people become a fuller member of that community of practice, then they're on your side, because that's actually what they want. They want to become more efficient at their jobs. I think it's different when you're in a pre-experience or in a university type setting, and your students are all 20, 21, 22, have never been in a company perhaps. The teachers probably got limited experience, particularly in certain industries. They may have experience in one or two jobs, but they won't have across the board experience. And then you can use this data-driven learning to try and bring in stuff from outside, but it becomes a little bit difficult, because data-driven learning in this sense is very much about looking at text from a particular context and then analyzing the necessary language. And of course, in a university, you never really know where your students are going to go. So that's more challenging, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, the appropriacy for the client, it kind of comes into play there. You have to see, all of these ideas, and that's sometimes I think teachers struggle with, because we hear all of these new interesting ideas, like, it's not new for me, but if somebody, is listening to this and says, oh, BELF and DDL, that's really interesting, I haven't heard of this, I'd like to start experimenting with it. You also have to make informed decisions about application of things, because if you have pre-service students
Yeah.
that have no context, they have no experience, it's not going to be as rich of an experience as you would imagine it to be.
No,
And
you're
vice
absolutely
versa.
right, of course. And to be fair, both these things, DDL and BELF, have been around for 15, 20 years. There's plenty of stuff out there. But I think
But
part
it's
of it
not, it's not well recognized.
is
That's
not well
they know
recognized.
it's been there.
And
It's just
teachers, if they do go and get trained, and lots of teachers don't get formally trained, but even if they do, these topics are covered only in a very limited way. I mean, these are BELF is for business English teachers. How many qualifications are there for business English teachers around the world? There are introductory certificates, and then you can go off and formally study it on a master's degree. But very few master's degrees focus on business English. You'd have to go to somewhere like China for that, I think. So
I think China's the only one that really has been offering business English as a course,
as a
right?
degree,
Yeah,
that's
as
right.
a major.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not here to try and convince you of anything, but since there's no certification programs, I know that you, even Mandy, we can get some other people involved, and possibly you guys could come up with something for business
No, we've
English
looked at
teachers.
it over the years. I've had so many conversations, but you need accreditation. In other words, you need an outside body which will come in and check the quality of what you're doing and check the quality of what all the different trainers are doing and how do you judge that. And that's normally quite a long, drawn out, formal process and quite expensive.
The other problem with that is the courses that teachers usually take, because they're all based on general English and things like
Yeah.
that. The ones at least that I've taken, I know that you've gone through a lot of them as well. It's going to be hard to pin down and assess teachers when we're giving them these concepts, but everything is so
Everything's
context dependent.
everything's context dependent and everything's in a state of flux. Teachers are saying,
Right.
well, do I need to invest in this master's degree, which will be out of date before I've finished it? Is AI really going to change the way business communication is done around the world? We don't know for sure. And then we're learning how much more multidisciplinary this is compared to what we thought. In the past, we really talked about English language teaching, but now we're talking about intercultural training all the time in business English, because that's one of the key facets of this type of communication. You are talking in an intercultural context. And I don't mean intercultural in the sense of national cultures. I mean cultures in the sense of the way different groups operate. If they are, whatever they are, engineers and lawyers of different cultures or different professions or different industries or different departments, and helping our students operate in these things is just as an important part of communication training as, the words and the grammar of English. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. The topic, in a sense, has exploded in scope from what it used to be.
In a good sense, it has exploded, because now we're finally looking at, maybe possibly not even all of the things that are, intertwined in here. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I have a final question, because I could talk to you all day, Evan. So where do you think, for business English teachers out there who might be listening, might not be listening, but I'm kind of selfishly asking this for me, where do we go? Like, how do we start? What should we do? What would be a good place to start to find information on this? To kind of
dependent on your context, I think. If you're working as a business English teacher, but you're employed as a university teacher, for example, you'll have restraints and constraints on you because of your local context, but at least you have money coming in. If you're a freelance business English teacher, you're in a very different world, because you're having to learn how to market yourself and sell yourself in a very competitive market, as it were. You might be working with your uncle's company, teaching all his staff in his company, and be very comfortable there. Thank you very much. So there's so many contexts, and it's very difficult to say where should we go. Personally, I think if you're young, you should probably try and experiment in different areas. If you like business English, then look at different types of business English. Find your niche. Perhaps that's a good way to do it. And your niche may end up being working in universities, or it may be working in a particular type of company. People become very good at English for engineering or maritime English or whatever, and they spend their whole lives specializing on one type of English. Or you may do something more general and work across international companies, or you may work with companies, if you work in Brazil and you have clients who often work with India, you might become a specialist in working with Brazilians speaking to Indians in English, because that brings its own particular set of complications or features of that language, which might be useful as a selling point. So yeah, there's no easy answer to that question, Kelly.
Man, I just wanted some life guidance here. No, but and that's the thing. Whenever I always ask people, I'm like, so what's your advice? Like, what should we do? What
Do what
you know?
makes you happy if you can. But yeah, that's an easy answer. That's a
Yeah,
glib
I feel like that's a cop out. We need to,
answer.
but
It is,
it's hard to nail down because there's so many
really
things,
hard.
and
It's really hard, and
even.
it's changing so fast. It's really
Mhm.
fast. Yeah.
And even in the idea of like just teaching, obviously from the resume that I was able to go through with you at the beginning, there's so many other things too. So you can go into the research aspect of it. You can,
Oh, there's
teach
fun. Yeah.
materials writing. There's so many different avenues that you can
And
just
they're all
branch out.
specialist areas, of course. People like to criticize materials writers, but to write materials for a publisher requires a certain set of skills, a certain
Mhm.
expertise, which doesn't come automatically. Likewise, if you're working in company, you need certain skills and certain expertise. If you've got a business background, that might be very useful, for example.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, how long's a piece of string?
Vastness. The
Yeah.
vastness of what we can do. See, we have a lot of opportunities. It's good.
Well, people
Okay.
do make a lot of money out in this game, but people also make very little money. So, it's all ends of the spectrum. So hopefully you'll all make enough money, or we'll all make enough money, in order to keep ourselves happy and keep our families going and things. I think that's the important thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you need to be able to
You need
maintain
to
a
be able to eat.
lifestyle.
You
Like,
need to be able to eat and drink,
yeah.
and live in a
Eat,
house.
live, yeah. But it's not the primary motivation a lot for people going into education, hopefully, is not money. Don't expect too much unless you're
Yes, yes.
very business oriented.
Maybe that's the topic for our next conversation. Are we
Yes.
in the business of education, or are we in the business of something else? Um, are
Yeah,
we in
the
education?
business
Are
of
we in education?
education
If
is.
you're working in corporate, if you're working in corporate training, learning and development, I'm not sure if the same word, the same connotations can be used. But that's something to think about
Yes,
at another time, Kelly.
things to consider in the future. Okay, well, I do want to thank you because I don't want to take too much of your time, but this was fantastic. I really enjoyed
Always nice
hearing
talking to you, Kelly. Always
about
nice
BELF
talking.
in detail. And you are welcome back anytime.
I
And
will-
I'm sure we'll have lots of things to talk about. So thank you very much. And
Thank
I'll
you.
see you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Ready to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Real Talk and ELT Pod or at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. That's it for me. Take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.